accordance with their own needs and interests, right? So that the attack, arguably, of global capitalism on the indigenous population interferes with the developmental rights of indigenous populations, right? Global capitalism interferes with the development. It interferes with the developmental rights of indigenous populations. Quick side note, though. It's totally off. It's not off topic, but I didn't anticipate doing it until now. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, has said that the 3 problems that we face in the 21st century. I just wrote on this, so it's fresh. I didn't just write on this a few months ago that I wrote on this, so it's sort of fresh in my mind. It was climate change, development, and food securities. Later I'll talk about food securities. But I think there's going to be a problem, just as a quick aside, there's going to be a problem in how we qualitatively conceptualize the idea of development, right? Development, if this is a potential crisis within the 21st century, in addition to climate change and food resources, scarcity of food and food security, development, whose development are we talking about? The indigenous population, the developmental rights that indigenous populations have, is arguably in direct conflict with sort of the broader developmental rights of industrialized nations, right? So when for example, and I really don't know the answer to this. I don't know that it has been sort of asked, right? By development, who do we mean, right? Because the development, you can see there's 2 competing concepts of development. Global capitalism uses resource acquisition from indigenous population to maximize profit, obviously, but some of that money goes into GDP, developmental, blah, 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 right? That development then comes at the expense of suppressing the development of indigenous populations. So when we talk about development, what exactly do we mean, right? We have to be careful when we use the word development, because it seems to be the case, at least for me, and I apologize if this got too deep too quick. It was just a side that just popped in my mind. When we talk about development, what do we mean by development, and whose development are we talking about? Just complete aside. Sorry about that. But you can see that global capitalism interferes with the developmental rights of indigenous populations. If in order to develop, let's say we're talking about an Amazon community, indigenous Amazonian community, just sort of stereotypically off the top of my head, and you have huge wood carvers coming in, gobbling up all of the trees, and those resources are used to do any number of things within the community. Then insofar as there aren't resources for me to sustain my life, not only is it a challenge to my survival, it undermines my ability to develop my community, right? So really, to even reinforce the point that I just said a couple minutes ago, is when we talk about development, it seems as though, it's like you evoke the idea of development at the expense of indigenous development. There really cannot be, I'm a little off topic here. But I don't, as an aside, I might do some research on this myself, right? By development, I'm very, as a philosopher, I'm trained, so equivocation becomes a problem. And it's just completely unclear by development what we mean by development. It can't be this general sort of hokey world development, everybody's development, right? There is a sense in which the development of one group parasitizes another group. The development of global capitalism parasitizes the development of indigenous populations. So by development, do we mean the development of global capitalism, the expansion of urbanization? Because if that's what we mean, then we have to recognize that insofar as we evoke that discourse of development, there's a subtext there which marginalizes an already marginalized population of indigenous peoples. So for those of you savvy NGO people and sort of grassroots young scholars, think, maybe I won't write on it, but think about that concept of development. Whose development are we talking about? Just as an aside, that caught me off guard for a second. Okay, so that article number 3. Article number 3 of United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Indigenous people have the right to self-determination. Obviously, we're talking about human rights. Human rights we know as sort of conceptual preconditions. I said this in the first installment of the video hours and hours ago. Equality, freedom, thank Jason. Equality, self-determination, equality, freedom, and liberty, right? So equality, freedom, liberty, and self-determination. So obviously, if we're talking about indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, right? By virtue of the right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Okay, so self-determination in the holistic sense. I skipped a lot, but I just went to the ones that I found most interesting. Article 8.1. Indigenous people and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture, right? I think that would be a little hard to apply that to Convention 107 of the International Labor Organization discourse. But yeah, you don't want to be forced assimilation. You don't want it to be the case that you have to relinquish your I hate the word traditional, it sounds so pejorative, but your traditional ancestral beliefs in order to be integrated and recognized, in order to have accessibility to education and political representation, in order to have legal, legislative representation, etc., etc. Right? Sort of good point. Article 10. Article 10. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands, right? This idea of dislocation, forced what's the word I'm looking for? Forced emigration, right? Forced migration. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, informed consent of the indigenous people, sort of this co-participation concerned, and after agreement or just the fair compensation and there possible with the option for return. Basically all that says is if sort of global capitalism sets in, they want the resources. As I said in the last section, there has to be some negotiation that goes on between the representative from global capital and the leaders and members, subordinates of the indigenous population, and we negotiate. If they decide to leave, then there needs to be some compensation with the option of potentially returning given some set of circumstances, right? Really good area for sort of international negotiation discourse. And there's a whole bunch that goes along with that. I mean, I teach negotiation, so it can get very, very technical, but I'm not going to get into that discussion now. Article 18. Article 18, indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making in matters that would affect their rights. I mean, right, you don't want it to be a paternalistic system. You don't want it to be the case that we are people in the know, and therefore, as people in the know, of a civilized manner, we're going to make decisions in your best interest. No, right? Indigenous Article 18 protects against that paternalism. It doesn't say that, but that's what it's doing. Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision-making institutions, right? Just for law, which is pretty boring. This is phenomenally well written, right? So the idea, I mean, that's basically a catch-all, right? Insofar as we are going to get into some negotiation process, at which point exercising self-determination we're going to arrive at some consequence. It has to be the case that